strengthened and increased foreign investment, improved credit rating by Moody's and Fitch, positive trade balance, and the government continues to take concrete actions to improve the fiscal stance of the country and to ensure that the structural reforms are being taken in a timely manner to ensure that it can support economic growth in the long term. Next slide, please. Mongolia is endowed with world-class mineral reserves. These are just approved geological reserves, and it shows, for instance, coal, about 10% of total world reserve of 31.9 billion tons. We have the fourth largest in the world in terms of copper, the Oyu Tolgoi project, which is operated by Rio Tinto in the south part of Mongolia, is one of the largest flagship projects of Rio Tinto and also one of the largest copper projects right now in the world. The iron ore, 1.7 billion tons, gold of 2,500 tons, zinc of about 404 million tons, fluorspar, uranium, and also crude oil. Only 6% of the country has been explored, so there is more opportunities to tap into more resources. The next one, please. The importance of the mineral sector in the economy. The graph shows that the contribution of the mineral sector in terms of the total exports is around 80–90% of the total export is from the mineral resources, and also the mineral sector makes up about over 30% of the total GDP. The next one, please. The mineral prices outlook supports recovery in the trade balance and the fiscal stance. Starting from 2016, the commodity prices have improved significantly, which shows the rebound in the economy. One of the policies that the government is taking is to ensure that during these times of the boom cycle, diversification of the economy is, the policies are being taken to support the diversification of the economy and to ensure that during the bust cycle, the other sectors of the economy can support the country. The composition of mineral export, the largest export products are copper and coal. As of last year, the country exported around 28 million tons of coal. This year, we estimate 34 million tons of coal. We estimate this year around 28 million tons of coal. The largest exporter of copper is the Rio Tinto large Oyu Tolgoi mine project and also the Erdnut coal mine project, which is located at the north part of the country. The next one, please. So the structural reforms to support economic growth include, of course, supporting of the mining sector, and secondly, this also includes privatization of private entities. This is state-owned entities and properties. The State Bank of Mongolia, the Stock Exchange of Mongolia, the Stock Exchange Clearinghouse, 20 provincial road maintenance companies, Mongolian Civil Aviation Authority, Mongol Post, Mongol Telecommunication Company, and Agricultural Commodity Exchange. A tax reform is also being undertaken by the government. It has been submitted to Parliament, soon to be approved. The tax reform has been taken after 10 years since 2007. This is to promote investment, lower tax schemes for SMEs, and we also increase benchmarks for corporate income tax, progressive tax, promoting also raising funds at financial markets, expanding also tax base by simplified regime for small and medium enterprises, improving governance of tax authority, and also to meet global forum and base erosion profit shifting standards that the country has recently joined in 2018. The public investment program has recently been approved. This is to implement 113 projects, each project over 30 billion MNT, roughly equals to about $12.5 million US. Total of about 38.3 trillion MNT Mongolian Tugruks, about $60 billion US public investment program is to be taking place. About 74% of the financing is going to be between 2018 and 2021. And out of the 38.3 trillion Togruks, about 53% of it is going to be financed by public-private partnership or from the private sector. The next one, please. So medium-term economic outlook looks very positive. The economy is going to continue to grow. We expect this year about 6.3%, next year about 8%, and 6% there onwards. We're also working hard to ensure that the debt to GDP ratio is lowered. In 2016, debt to GDP ratio was at 74%. Next year, we're working to bring it down to 55%. This year at about 64%. So this is just to give you an economic outlook of the current status of the country and where the country is heading so far. The Extended Fund Facility Program so far has proven that the country has, of course, structural reforms that need to be taken, and we're meeting the fiscal targets that are being put out by the IMF. We're working to ensure that the country is well diversified in terms of the economy and ensure that also we are investing into social infrastructure such as schools and kindergartens, given that the 30% of the population is under the age of 18 and 60% of the population is under the age of 35. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. 続きまして。
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the First Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Mongolia, Mr. Eldenberg Ocherfu.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for Nikkei for inviting me and having me as a panelist. And thank you for your kind introduction, Ken. As was mentioned earlier, Mongolia is not only a commodity economy, it's import-dependent country as well, and we are prone to capital inflows and capital inflow-related implications and risks. And a few years ago, as was mentioned earlier, a combination of domestic and external factors resulted in difficulty that we were not able to manage by ourselves. And we sought support from the IMF, Japan, other multilateral and bilateral partners. Domestic developments in regulatory environment, completion of OT, open pit mine in 2012, coincided with the commodity price shocks and resulting in a weakening of fiscal and external position. And it took a toll on the economic growth. So bringing the financing gap on the BOP and the fiscal to an unsustainable level. And instead of curbing the off-budget spending and quasi-fiscal activities, the authorities at that time engaged themselves in expansionary policies, and that resulted in reserve depletion. And on one side, and on the other side, the debt sustainability issue was at risk. So, as you may know, 2016 June there were elections, and the newly formed government, one of the first steps they took was the rapid fiscal consolidation. And at the same time, it happened that the central bank management has changed, and what we did was that we discontinued all the quasi-fiscal activities by the central bank. And besides that, what we did was that we tried to look beyond the immediate issues, and we tried to address the structural issues in Mongolia regarding the central bank and the banking sector. So, and then after that, I think time-wise, IMF got involved, and as the saying goes, the rest is history. Okay. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, thank you very much. そうしましたら最後になりますが、
So, Mr. Zorik Dashitorov. So, from 2008 to 2012, he is the former Minister of Mineral Resource and Energy. He was also a member of Parliament. He's the non-staff advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Zorik Dashitorov. Would you please give us your brief introduction?
Thank you very much. Ken just introduced me and identified the fact that I'm a non-staff advisor to the foreign minister, which means that I have a luxury of doing other things in my life. At the same time as I am an advisor to the foreign minister, I also perform as an executive director of Mongolia Development Strategy Institute. This is a privately funded institute which focuses on macro policy issues and provides research and advice on issues related to international trade, security, and other issues and governance issues related to Mongolia's development. Also, I have my consultancy business, and I sit on the boards of several Mongolian private companies, so I engage in many different activities at this point. I have made a small presentation also just to give you a little bit of a context into our discussion today, and it relates to Mongolia and Japan trade and investment relations. What is the current state and the potential? Next slide, please. The numbers here probably are not that much visible, but the last line that you can see here is that Mongolia's trade with Japan in 2007 in total was under 370 million US dollars. It's a very small number, annual trade turnover between Japan and Mongolia. Only 14 million out of that is Mongolia's exports to Japan, and Japan exports to Mongolia more than $350 million of goods. These are usually cars, equipment, consumer goods, etc., etc. Mr. Butbol just said and identified the fact that Mongolia has an economic partnership agreement with Japan, and this is the only free trade agreement that Mongolia has with any other country in the world. And Mongolia also, of course, a member of WTO, but that's the only free trade agreement that we have. We hope very much that the signing of economic partnership agreement between Mongolia and Japan will help us to create balance in our trade relationship with Japan, which at this point, as you can see, is very much in favor of Japan. But also we hope that it will help us to increase Japanese investment to Mongolia in order to utilize Mongolia's resources and then use Japanese export markets. Next slide, please. As Minister Bulgantoya just said, Mongolia is actually quite well known probably in this region for its mineral resources. We have plenty of deposits, in various minerals. We have, but the territory of Mongolia is very big. It's, I think, if I am correct, I think it's 19th largest country in the world by territory. But only under 10% of the Mongolia's territory has been explored by geological exploration, which means that there are many more probably discoveries are there to be made in Mongolia. But, next slide, please. The focus of the government and the focus of the business community now, especially, is on other areas than mining. Of course, the mining is the biggest growth engine for Mongolia. Of course, we expect that the mining will continue to be the biggest growth engine for Mongolia. But we all have to remember that mining is a very capital-intensive area, but does create little jobs. And in terms, of course, it creates a lot of taxes and a lot of other sources for income for the businesses. But in terms of employment creation, other sectors like agriculture, tourism are very important for us. So just to give you some example, we have a 3 million population, but we have almost 70 million livestock, sheep, goat, cows, camels, horses. So in terms of population, for 3 million population, we have 70 million livestock. So every person on this table, each Mongolian maybe can have at least 20 heads of livestock. So But we also have a huge land mass. We are located near China and next to the Chinese big market. We are located very close to Northeast Asian big market like Japan and South Korea. And the land mass allows us to do lots of crop production. You may think that Mongolia is a very cold country, and Mongolia is known as a very cold country in terms of territory. But we have to also remember that Canada is one of the largest crop producers in the world, wheat producers in the world. And in terms of climate, Mongolia is not very much different from Canada. And the potential for crop production is huge in Mongolia, especially given the land mass and proximity to the Chinese market. And we believe that this is where the next potential lies. Just to give you an example of what is there in those areas, please next slide. For instance, Kashmir. Last year, I believe, right, in 2016 or 17, Mongolia became, for the first time, the largest producer of raw Kashmir in the world. So far, the numbers, if you see and open the internet and look at the internet, they always say that China is the largest producer of raw Kashmir, and Mongolia usually supplies about 30 to 40%. But last year, for the first time, Mongolia became the largest producer of raw Kashmir. What does it mean is that usually about 50-something% is produced in Mongolia, 40-something of raw Kashmir percent are produced in China, and the rest of the 2%, only 2%, is produced in Afghanistan and Iran and some other countries. It gives Mongolia a natural monopoly of a very expensive fabric that can only, by nature, be produced in Mongolia. This is like a natural monopoly that exists given by God. So we believe that, especially in areas of fine fabric, there is a great potential. There are Mongolian companies which are already having access to Japanese markets thanks to EPA. For instance, I heard that there is a company called Gobi, one of the largest Mongolian Kashmir producers, which has already opened its shops in Mongolia. There are many other producers in Mongolia which are waiting to enter the Japanese market. But I will give you one example. Why is it difficult for Mongolian companies? Mongolian companies have to certify 2 or 3 times their Kashmir and Kashmir product to enter the Japanese market. Raw material, the yarn, the product, and all these certification processes, quality check processes, are quite complicated for any producer who is entering initially the market. So there are these it's not probably barriers, but things that we have to talk between each other. Mongolian trade organizations and authorities, and Japanese trade authorities and organizations, and also Mongolian companies have to learn in order to enter the Japanese market. Even in a rather simple market like Kashmir, it's rather complicated. Next, please. As I said, Mongolia has over 70 million livestock, which means that potentially this is one of the largest producers of skins and hides in the world. 70 million skins and hides, livestock. So this is one of the huge potential areas for next possible cooperation. Please, next. Tourism. Many Japanese people come to Mongolia, but Japan is one of the countries where Mongolia has allowed visa-free regime. So the Japanese people can come to Mongolia without visa for tourist purposes and stay in Mongolia for a certain number of days and have a free access to Mongolia. Right now, a new airport is being finished. Actually, it has been built with the Japanese government loan. And the Japanese companies, if I'm not mistaken, companies, including, for instance, Mitsui and Haneda Airport, etc., they are going to manage that airport in Mongolia. We hope very soon that the joint venture negotiations and other things, details will be finished very soon, and this airport can start its operation. And this will increase, we hope, very much the flow of tourists, especially from Japan to Mongolia. Next, please. Energy is something that we all like to talk about. Mongolia is located in the heart of Central Asia, the heart of Asian landmass. And as you know, we have a Gobi Desert. And Gobi Desert has a solar and wind energy potential which is second in the world after the Sahara Desert. So there is this famous idea, probably you heard about Asian supergrid to supply energy, renewable energy from Mongolia to the rest of Asia, including Japan. It's a little bit far away, but I think the technologies already exist in terms of energy, the electricity transmission, in terms of production of solar and wind energy that technologically allows us to do it now. Even now we can do it. And the price of production for this kind of solar energy is probably cheaper than in Japan already. Also, because of the coal reserves that Mongolia has potentially is one of the cheapest producers of energy, electricity in Asia. Coal reserves and water reserves. So energy and electricity is the area we think is one of the most potential areas for Mongolia in the future. Please, next. I'm going to finish now. I just want to say why. There are over 470 Japanese companies now. The big Japanese names like Sumitomo, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, others are here. I saw some friends recently, from Marubeni, right? Who said that he's going to be present today. I'm going, for instance, tonight to meet some friends from Mitsui, who are also here in Mongolia. So we already have big names, Japanese big names in Mongolia. And Japanese companies already relatively feel themselves comfortable in Mongolia. Next slide, please. But there are vivid examples. For instance, Mongolia's largest telecommunication operator is owned by KDDI. So Japanese KDDI is probably 99 or maybe 100% owner of Mongolian largest telecom operator called Mobicom. So they have a very good experience of working in Mongolia. One of the largest Mongolian banks, actually probably the largest Mongolian bank, has an investment from Japan. And I think the shareholder there is one of the quite well-known Japanese businessmen who also owns a tourism business. Sawada-san, right? I think. Yes. Tourism business. There are other examples of large Japanese businesses in Mongolia which are doing quite well. Next slide, please. Smaller investors, very unusual things like, for instance, the fruit juices or facial and beauty products from Mongolian natural products produced by Japanese. Next slide, please. They say that, please next slide. They say that Mongolia may be the investment environment not very stable, but there are lots of international agreements that we have that protect international investment into Mongolia. Next slide. We have all sorts of negotiations going on free trade agreements. We already have one with Japan, and Japanese investor economic partnership agreement actually has a very strong investor protection clauses in it. Next, please. We had, lots of actions by the government to promote investment in Mongolia. Next slide, please. Could you press one more time? Yeah. Next. You see, we provide lots of tax and non-tax incentives to foreign investors in free zones, through investment agreements, through support of SMEs. We also have agreements with various countries, and also we provide land and other infrastructure other infrastructure on a relatively favorable basis. Next, please. So many Japanese companies working, quite a lot of Japanese investment in Mongolia, but not very much, not very much. And Japan accounts only for 4% of total investment into Mongolia right now, only 4%. So we hope that Japanese investment will grow through the EPA. Next, please. This is the actions that have been taken by the government, Investor Council, to look at the complaints by the foreign investors, established the National Development Agency, which has been abolished previously by under the previous government. Next, please. And we have been working with World Bank and other international organizations to increase the transparency and investment environment in Mongolia. Next, please. So what I'm going to say is that, to repeat the message, that Mongolia is back on the investment map. The government is determined to do good on its promises. And we already had a chance to grow by 17.5%, and the potential for double-digit growth is there. And we hope that Japanese friends will come and join with us on this very good opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zorit. From now, we are going to start discussion. First, I'd like to raise a question of role of Mongolia in international politics. Mongolia has been having a unique position, having diplomatic relationship with Democratic Republic of Korea or North Korea and the Western countries and China. So actually, Japan has been really dependent on, Mongolia in communicating with North Korea for many years. But after Mr. Donald Trump became president of the United States, the things have changed totally in international relations. Nothing can be taken for granted now. All the status quo is broken by Mr. Trump. And for a good proof, today he met Kim Jong-un in Singapore. And they're going to, actually I'm not following the news because I'm doing this, but they're about to sign a document. That's what they declared. And that's going to change the total dynamics surrounding Mongolia in international relations. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Badbolt, how should Mongolia change its strategy in international politics? And maybe it includes a trade strategy too, because Donald Trump is challenging the multilateral regime, including WTO. But Mongolia has been basically dependent on multilateral regime, except for Japan. So how should Mongolia change its diplomatic strategy?
Yeah, I think before we think to change the strategy, I think we probably should remember what was before. And I think Mongolia has traditionally, historically, a very good relation with North Korea, and especially before the 1919, before the regime has changed this in Mongolia. And somehow we have kept that our relation with North Korea by keeping the ties between our two countries, two governments and two people. We have kept the exchange of our people through the cultural events and arrangements. And we have kept our embassies in our both capitals. And we thought that we should keep engaged North Korea, not to put into the isolation, and we should be seeking the ways to solve the issues through the dialogue. That was our position from the beginning, and that is the good thing is that that's happening throughout all these years, and hopefully we may see the certain good results of our efforts that we think that we have done at our utmost to give a contribution we could give to the peace and stability in our region and especially on Korean Peninsula. In the past, there was a six-party talks, and although Mongolia was not part of that talks, but we have been keeping our bilateral ties. We've been talking with our partners, like Japan, on certain issues, and we have provided the venues and also talks on certain specific issues of abducted people, for instance, in Mongolia, between North Korea and Japan, and we were keeping this channel warm, as our partners, Americans, have also advised, and we were keeping this channel warm, and we are keeping it today, and we hopefully will keep it even warmer for the future, with given situations, hopefully with the positive results and situations in the relations between the countries, especially in Northeast Asia. So we have, as I said, the relation on a cultural and people-to-people level, but we do not have much of a relation on trade and investment with North Korea so far. But there are certain interests that have been mentioned and stated on many occasions before, and there are good knowledge and trust and understanding of the countries of each other, the history and traditions, and there are, I think, good advantages that we can be also part of these changes and make our contribution to the new situations and new challenges which we hopefully face positively. And we are ready to make our, again, utmost contribution to this situation. And even today, we have certain mechanisms working in this context. We have the mechanism of dialogue called Ulaanbaatar Dialogue, and this is going to take place this week in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar, and on June 14th and 15th, regardless to the discussions and results. But we are keeping again this channel warm, and we will have the parties concerned to come to this Ulaanbaatar dialogue this week, including the delegates from Japan and South Korea, and including the delegation representatives from North Korea, and the government organizations and non-governmental also organizations will be represented, and over 150 people we are expecting to have in Ulaanbaatar this week, again to deal and to support the discussions and dialogues between the parties concerned on the issues that we find important. And this is happening 5th time in Ulaanbaatar this week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, I'd like to move to, actually, we are running out of time already, but I'd like to move to economic issues. Especially, I'd like to hear from Ms. Bulgantuya how much progress you have made in tackling structural reforms, which were part of the package and agreement with IMF and other donor countries. Especially, I'm interested in is child money. As you know, Mongolia has a system called child money. So, household who has a certain age of child can get the cash subsidy from the government, and it's been a political issue for many years. How much should be given, and which age should be given, and whether or not there should be a household income cap for this system. And IMF has been demanding to rationalize, not to give everyone a lot of money, but to rationalize this social welfare system to take fiscal balance in the government budget. And what has been done for the past 1.5 years, and what is the current status, and what is the discussion going on?
You're asking a very hot topic right now that is happening in Mongolia. As I have previously mentioned, Mongolia's population is very, very young. It is our dependency ratio is also quite high, but this is due to the fact that we have a very young population. 30% of the population is under the age of 18, and about 60% of the population is under the age of 35. To ensure that a small country with only 3.2 million population, and especially during this population window, can be well supported, the country provides roughly 20,000 tugurks, which is roughly about $8 per month to each child until they reach 18. This is to ensure that when they reach, and most of the households, they save it for tuition fees when they reach university, or in some of the households with lower income, use it for day-to-day consumption. And to ensure that all children have been provided, up until 2016, it was 100% of all children have been provided. And with that, actually the country has been criticized that we spend about 2.4% of our GDP for social welfare programs. And from 2017 onwards, especially under the IMF program, we have been advised that we need to target the social spending, and especially the child money, to the lowest 60 percentile of the children. However, this has created a bit of a turmoil amongst, especially the issue has been very politicized, that the government is, instead of protecting and providing for all the children, is targeting the children, whether they are poor or rich. And this has, with the IMF and with the bilaterals and the multilaterals, we have discussed to increase the 60% coverage to 80%. The fiscal amount is actually, the pressure on the budget is actually not that much, about $20 million per annum. However, the issue that it creates is that the government is not being supportive of all children. This is due to the fact that, especially in 2014, the poverty rate was about 20%. Within 2 years, in 2016, it rose to 29.4%, almost a 10% increase, and we have reached to the level of almost the 1990s period. And this has also, the last time, especially the civil servants, for instance, wage increase was in 2014. And since 2014 to 2016, up until now, there's almost about 20% inflation, which eroded away into the livelihood of the households. Around 70% of the households have lower than median household income, and about 80% of the children are living in households with lower than median income. So the reason to increase the child money coverage is to ensure that, especially during this economic difficult time, that the children are well protected. This also creates, of course, problems. Having a very young population means extra strain on the budget to ensure that schools and kindergartens are provided, which is why 1/3 of the new investment from the public investment is being made into schools and kindergartens, especially from the bilaterals, from JICA and from multilaterals, from ADB and World Bank. We invest heavily to ensure that the schools and kindergartens are well provided. We also need to ensure that also the health sector can provide the young population as well. Right now, this summer, we will be a large hospital in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city, will be coming online, and this is fully financed by the grant by the Japanese government. Another big flagship project that is going to be coming online at the end of this year is the new airport that is about 56 billion yen project. and which is going to be operated by 4 large Japanese companies. So we believe especially that the young population right now needs support, especially during these difficult times. But at the same time, we are taking some very prudent actions. We're cutting capital expenditure during these difficult times. We're freezing public sector wages up until end of 2018. We have about 182,000 public servants serving for a 3.2 million population. We're raising retirement age for both men and women by 3 months per annum, reaching to 65. Unfortunately, our livelihood is actually much lower, about 65 for men, a little above for women. We're also targeting social spending. And on the revenue side, we're tapping into revenues for increasing the excise taxes, taxing on deposit interest income, and also increasing social security contribution rate. We also, to ensure that we maintain budget discipline through fiscal structure reforms. What we have seen in the past is that whenever we see a boom in the mining sector, the expenditure gets also overinflated. We often overestimate our revenue, and also expenditure gets inflated at the same time. The Parliament is creating a Fiscal Stability Council, which is comprised of former ministers of finance, prime ministers, central bank governors, to ensure that they can give an unbiased opinion to the budget that is being discussed at the Parliament level. The Ministry of Finance is also giving consent on laws and the regulations to ensure that it has no negative impact on the budget as well. The debt sustainability measures are being taken to reduce debt to GDP ratio, as I have mentioned, which was at about 74% in 2016, and bringing it down to 55% in 2019. We have, starting from 2012, the country has started to issue sovereign bonds, and the Central Bank and the Exim Bank, which is our development bank of Mongolia, has also issued bonds. The last 2 bonds that we have issued has been issued about 5.6% yield. We have been oversubscribed. The both bonds that were issued in 2017 and also at the end of 2017. And the gross financing needs during the post-program are also being met by IFIs, by PPPs, and also by the private sector. We have a very vibrant business community, a very young population, very well-educated population, and very well-endowed in terms of the mineral resources. The most important thing that is being advised by the international institutions are the right legal environment has to be sure to ensure that the government is supportive of the investment into the country, and also during the times of the increase in the revenue, that the right kind of investment is made, especially into social infrastructure, and also infrastructure into the roads and the railway networks. Even though the country has abundant mineral resources, there is poor infrastructure that makes it quite difficult to be competitive.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a comprehensive explanation. Going into monetary side, I think inflation has been always a headache for Mongolian economy for many years. And I think it has been always IMF's demand to control inflation at the low level and to establish a kind of scheme to do that. And how this goal has been met and what has been done and what are you trying to do? Can I ask Mr. Erdem Bilek?
I think you can. Before going into that question, I'd like to touch upon the structural reforms that you have mentioned earlier. As I have mentioned earlier, one of the first things was that we tried to address them. And what we did at the central bank is that now we are drafting like drafting amendments to 11 laws. Some of them are new laws, some of them are the amendments. And as recently as a few months ago, actually it is enacted from April 1st. We do have a new central banking law, and then we do have a banking law as well. But my understanding is that one of the lessons learned from the 2009 crisis and the standby arrangement by the fund was that the structural reforms were not, how should I put it, not delivered or not followed through fully. So that is why the result was that we are in a crisis again starting from 2012. So it was not just our own assessment, but it was the fund's assessment. And that is the reason actually why we are implementing this program called Extended Fund Facility. And the distinguishing feature of this from the standby arrangement or the other fund programs is that it is long. It's a 3-year program, and the purpose is that to address the structural reforms. So as for the inflation, with the before we got engaged with the fund on the program changed the sentiment in the country, the market sentiment. But it helped easing pressure on exchange rate, for example. As I've mentioned earlier, Mongolia is not just a commodity economy; it's an import-dependent economy. So, meaning that exchange rate plays an important role when it comes to the life of Mongolians. And although we do see that the BOP pressure, the exchange rate pressure, have eased a bit. And then there are some external factors where we do see like coke and coal prices are increasing, copper prices are increasing. But domestically, what we do see is that domestic demand is still sluggish.
Okay.
And if you look at the credit growth, you do see some 10-12% of credit growth. But when you destructure that credit growth, only maybe 1 to 2% is corporate growth. The rest is consumer lending. So what it got to do with consumer lending is that it's not going into the productive investment. What is happening is that it is financing the consumption on the BOP side. It is supporting the imports, and then in turn it will have impact on the exchange rate, and in turn it will have impact on inflation. So these are the things that we considered, and we do consider these are the things why we've been, I wouldn't say easing, but why we've been very conservatively easing, lowering our policy rate so far during the last 1.5 years. But there is another factor is that if you recall, in August 2016, we have increased our policy rate by 400 basis points. And the developments of that time were that exchange rate was depreciating. Starting from, in 2012, we had reserves stood at about 4 billion. And in 3 years' time, the reserves have shrunk to 1 billion. But the shrinkage was about 6 billion. So that 1 billion from 2014 stayed for till end of 2016 was partly due to the swap line with PBOC. So basically, we kept the gross reserve at the same level, but the liability side, affecting the net reserves, have been increasing. So this is where the depletion comes in. And
yeah, I have one question. So there is a pressure against emerging economy currencies right now, again, because of a higher interest rate going up in the United States, and also partly maybe because Donald Trump America First policy. And are you feeling that pressure too? And are you going to do something about it?
Of course. After the Fed increased the policy rate, when they started tightening the monetary policy, some countries, they followed the suit and then they tightened it. And specifically in our case, it will be the Chinese monetary policy. They tightened their monetary policy. And what happened was that it had impacted the interbank market. And in our case, for example, the swap line with the PBOC, the interest rate structure is such that the SHIBOR is the base rate. So when the tightening effect in China increases SHIBOR, one thing. So it is a burden for us, yes. The second thing is that let's say from early 2014 till today, RMB has appreciated by 40% against Mongolian tugrik. So that is, again, a pressure on our obligation, on our liability. So it's at the same time, it's a reserve management issue. At the same time, it's a liability management issue. And, but I'm talking about the central bank only. But if you look at the debt sustainability or the debt issue of whole Mongolia, we do see a hump in 2020. So we need to, from the liability management perspective, we need to smoothen it out. And then we, if it is possible, try to lower that hump and then make it a smooth. Otherwise, if you look at the profile, the hump is like, by 2020, our expectation is that the reserves will be about 5 billion. And then the payment will be about 2.7 billion. So it's basically we will have to pay half of our reserves in our debt obligations, but it's 2020 only. 21 will be coming, 22 will be coming, 23 will be coming. And these are the Chinggis bonds, these are the Gerege bonds, these are the Horalta bonds. So, of course, the liability management is important, and we try to manage our debt, but at the same time, our obligation, but at the same time, we do work with the government on this.
Well, definitely, you need to keep improving balance on payments, and prevent it from becoming bad again. And also, I think you need to keep accumulating reserve as well for bad times. And is it going well? Probably, yeah, you or Ms. Bulgantuya, what do you think?
I was appointed in July 2016, and reserves at that time the gross reserves, they stood at 1 billion. And the net reserves were in the negative territory. So today, the reserves, they stand at 3 billion. So the gross reserves have increased by 3 times, and the net reserves are in a positive territory. So we've been accumulating reserves, but at the same time, we've been sterilizing that excess liquidity in our markets. And if you look at the central bank balance sheet, the outstanding CBB bills, 2 years ago, they were standing at 1 trillion Tugriks. Now we have 5 trillion Tugriks. So we are trying to address all those things. And one of the things is, again, it's going back to the structural reforms. Number of years ago, the central bank tried to introduce a macroprudential instrument or policy, so to speak. But at the time, number of questions were raised whether we have a legal authority to do that, and the question of how do you define the economic cycle, and how do you define the financial cycle, and how do you know where we are on the cycle? So these are the questions left without answers. And what happened is that one of the things that we incorporated into our central banking law was now we have a legal authority to take or introduce a macroprudential policy. And now, I mentioned earlier about the credit growth. It's very consumer-led credit growth we do see. And it has some risk, it has negative impacts. And we are thinking about introducing some macroprudential, systemic macroprudential instruments in order to curb that, which will have a positive impact on the BOP, and we'll have, how should I put it? It will have positive impact on the imports. But at the same time, it shouldn't be just the central bank policy. We need fiscal discipline from the government side, and we do see that when they consolidated off-budget, 4 channels of budget spending into one. So these things are, very good.
Okay. Just to clarify on that.
About the fiscal discipline, especially.
About the fiscal discipline, and not only that, the reason that the debt management has become an issue for us is this was started from 2012, that we started raising bonds, and we went probably way too overboard with it. First, it started with the Chinggis bond of about 5% yield, then on the last bond that the previous government had raised in 2016 was about 11%. The reason being is that the fiscal discipline was not in place. The expenditure, the budget expenditure was rising, the revenue was not coming in as expected, and that was being met by various international bonds that were being, that the government was issuing. The revenue is streaming in, but at the same time, we really need to make sure that, number one, the fiscal discipline is being met. Number two, even the government itself we have been told that we need to be better at investment relations. it's been only about 6 years that we started having relations with bondholders, both the government of Mongolia and also the Development Bank of Mongolia. We need to be better informed, and also on international media, we need to be making sure that the positive messages are superseding, that the government the economic growth is increasing, the government is being responsible towards investment, is being attracting investment in various sectors, that the economy is diversifying, and that especially the fiscal discipline is in place.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'd like to ask Mr. Zorik. Yesterday, Mr. Budbold mentioned the importance of professional, autonomous public servants in economic and social development of a country. And you mentioned Japanese success as an example, but that's also very true to Mongolia, indeed. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Zorik, what's happening to introduce this high-level expert, non-corrupt, autonomous public service in Mongolia? I think you know several examples of improvements.
Yes. I myself did my doctoral degree in Kyushu University, actually just a couple of years ago. To my shame, I didn't learn much of Japanese. I can probably order some food, go around and talk to some of my friends, but not much of the sitting on this panel. And that's why I support very much yesterday's proposal and program that has been announced by Prime Minister Abe, J-Proud, where he said that the Japanese government is going to bring in 2,000 students from Asia every year to study the Japanese developmental experience. And I support it very much because you need to bring young people, to learn Japanese and to learn the experience here in Japan. Why I think it's very important is because Japan is the first country which made this transition to become a highly developed industrial state. And the countries that followed, like for instance Singapore, South Korea, or economies like Taiwan, they all had one similarity. One was that this rational public policy, which was developed with a wide consultation with stakeholders like businesses, business associations, and it was developed by a professional, autonomous public service. Autonomous public service which was, free from political influence, but at the same time the politicians were able to oversee and control and monitor that public service in terms of quality. And this public service was based on merit and long-standing service. So there are lots of Mongolians who studied in Japan, like me, and who studied the Japanese experience. And we have introduced the changes into the public service law in 2017. The parliament has adopted the law, amended the law on public service. And now, in Mongolian public service, this public service law will start being implemented from 1st January 2019. It's very similar to Japanese law. In order to become a head of division, you have to be a head of department at least 5 years. In order to be a head of department, you have to be a head of chief of section at least for 3 years. In order to be a chief of section, you have to be at least senior officer for 3 years. So minimum requirement to become a permanent secretary in the ministry, you have to be at least 16 years in the public service, etc., etc. You have to go through examination to enter the public service. Very strict examination you have to go through. There are requirements not only...
Is that going to start next year?
We have examinations, but the requirements for examinations are going to be very strict starting from 1st January. So this is the law that we copied a lot from Japan, from China, from Singapore. And I think the secret of East Asian developmental miracle is actually one of this. Is focus on public service, merited public service, focus on education, focus on public health and infrastructure.
So do you think this new public service law would prevent a phenomenon like a certain politician or businessman appointed as a head of a department in certain ministry, and he invites his friends or relatives to, to support him in the office and appoint as a, deputies, and that kind of phenomenon. Do you think it's going to prevent that kind of phenomenon?
Yes, we actually had a very stable public service up until probably mid-2000. Starting from early 2000, mid-2000, after 2004, 5, the public service also became a little bit unstable. As you said, lots of political influence, somebody invites his friends, etc., etc. So after 10 years of this instability, the politicians have decided that, yes, we have to change this. We have to make sure that it's professional and nobody can bring in friends or relatives, So they have to close this loop. And now, starting from 1st of January 2019, the law hopefully will be, of course, it will take time, to make this transition. Of course, no, it will not be only weapon to fight the corruption, but it will be a very big step. And I think these amendments to public service law will be counted as one of the major reforms this parliament has been able to make during these 4 years, I think.
That's very, very, very encouraging. Okay, I think I should wrap up the panel already. Because it's 5:20. Last question. So Mongolia needs to diversify its economy. That's something everybody agrees upon, I think. And what kind of diversification, what kind of industry is there that Mongolia can nurture? I think I will ask one by one from Mr. Bartbold.
Okay. Yeah, I think, yes, we generally, what I could say is Mongolia is a good example of democracy and transition, even though we face so many challenges. But I think as a country, within very short span of period of time, we made quite successful changes, especially in the heart of Central Asia. And we think that we have true democracy, and we have done the transition to the democratic changes within this short span of time, and we are now aiming for the strengthening of the institutions of democracy in Mongolia. I think that's the aim what the whole country and people should aim, and that is the process we are taking forward with the governments and with the elections. Secondly, Mongolia has, as my colleagues have already mentioned, there are many competitive advantages. Of course, we have agreement with Japan like EPA. This is something real that we should make better benefits for Mongolia and for our partners. But on top of that, we have certain favorable conditions from other partners. For instance, we have signed again, when I was working as a Minister of Trade and Industry, we have signed with the European Union certain favorable trade arrangement that is called GSP+, which provides to goods and services from Mongolia. It's about over 7,000 items that includes. We have duty-free access to European market. And this is renewed by every 3 to 5 years, and we still have this preference. We have also a basic agreement which is called Trade and Investment Framework Agreement with the United States, where we have certain preferences also. But we would like to upgrade that and negotiating to make also by applying to the goods like cashmere products and other products produced in Mongolia. We have been talking with the US, for instance, on the transparency agreement on that to justify and to go to the next level of our cooperation with that. We have also certain preferential treatment with Russia, which we have successfully negotiated when they have succeeded WTO. So basically, not only the abundant resources of Mongolia, which we have, but we have the certain these advantages that we could make better use of that. But there are certain problems which I would like to address, especially in this audience. We have a challenge, and what we need really to have is knowledge and technology. We need to add the value to our commodities and services. By this, we can create more employment, job opportunities, more values, more taxes, so that this becomes really the true benefit to Mongolia. So Japan is definitely one of the best candidates in terms of technology transfer, knowledge, and as being the largest donor and the best partner for Mongolia for last over 25 years or since the 1919. So that is a very genuine trust and hope that we are here talking to this very esteemed audience. And we are very grateful that we have this opportunity to talk about that. We are very grateful to the organizers, to Ken, to you especially, to give us this floor today. And we hope that through you we could send this message that Mongolia is really the place that could be interesting and competitive and could give the best also results for the parties concerned if they are dealing with Mongolia. So we think that we are very confident in terms of political system, what I mentioned. In terms of tax and legal system, we are improving, and we are now starting to debate and discuss the tax reform this week in our parliament. And we hope that this will again give better environment and better condition to the investors and to of course to local and international investors. So we hope that events like this and opportunities like this will give us more chances to have more friends and investors and partners to Mongolia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Batbot. Next, Ms. Bulgantuya.
Thank you. So especially the government is now focused on diversifying the economy in two areas. Number one is agriculture, given the fact that 70 million cattle, lots of arid land, untouched land, and given the fact that also we have one of the largest consumer right next to us. The initiatives are being taken, and there's a lot of room, especially Japanese investors can take advantage of the EPA and also the agreements that we have with Europe for concessional terms on exporting of goods and products from Mongolia. In 2006, for instance, in comparison to 2006, as of last year, the export of agricultural food goods have quadrupled, has increased by 4 times. Yet at the same time, with the increase of export of mineral products, it has been diluted. And in 2006, when it was about 21.4% of the export of goods was in agriculture, it has come down to about 8.4%. But there is a lot of room, and this shows, for instance, the agricultural and food processing sector makes up about 20% of the total GDP. The other area is tourism. As of in 2017, in comparison to 2016, the number of tourists has increased by about 14%. There are problems, of course, given the fact that we're a very seasonal country. In January, it can reach down to minus 30, 40 degrees. And in the summer, a very long but also very welcoming summer season where we receive the largest number of tourists. The fact that we will be having a new airport coming online that can accommodate tourists, that can have direct flights to a number of destinations, will also support increase in the tourism industry. A number of projects are also being implemented with ADB, with World Bank, and also with the bilaterals to support the tourist industry. As Mr. Zork, former Minister of Mine and also Energy, has pointed out, that the energy and infrastructure sector are also some of the areas that, especially large corporations from the region and also from other regions, are interested into investing. We have to take into consideration that Mongolia has 15 strategic mines, and a 17% economic growth has been achieved when the country has tapped into only one of the strategic mines. The large 10% of the coal reserves, as we have mentioned, the large TT project, Tawantolga project, if it comes online, it's going to have a huge impact on the economy, also going to be raising huge demand in terms of infrastructure and consumption into other goods. So we are, especially with the EPA, with Japan, especially with the fact that we have now also cultural bridges that has been built with students that have studied in Japan from Mongolia, with investment agreements that has been signed. We believe already also the cultural barrier bridge is also there.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bergantuya. And then Mr. Erden Bilek, your proposal to the future of Mongolia.
When it comes to diversification, I will let my colleagues answer.
Okay. Okay, then Mr. Zorik.
Yeah, I think my colleagues already said that everything that Mongolia has to offer, agriculture, tourism, mining. I think for Japan, there are interesting opportunities as well in terms of, Mongolia. Just one example, for instance. In Mongolia, I know the companies which are opening private equity funds funded from Japanese private sources. Because, for instance, in Mongolia, just to give you an example, a US dollar bank deposit has about 6% rate deposit, whereas in Japan, I think it's much lower. So I know some of my friends which are opening investment funds from Japanese private sources, private people's money, to invest in Mongolia. Even putting the money in the bank is much more profitable than just keeping it here in Japan. It's a very simple example. Kashmir, under the EPA signed, Mongolia has a duty-free access to Japanese market, Kashmir market. But Chinese products have to pay 10% export tax for Chinese products. Margins on these Kashmir products are very low, profit margins. So 10% export tax is very high impact on the import. So I know some Japanese who are bringing in Chinese equipment to start to consider thinking about producing in Mongolia and importing to Japan, using the Chinese equipment, for instance, in Japanese equipment, like for instance, Shinseki or other Japanese equipment and Chinese technologies in Kashmir. So there are very peculiar small areas where people don't notice much, and you have to study more. Like I just gave you an example of equity funds in Kashmir. So there are many, many opportunities because of resources that Mongolia has, and capital and technology and knowledge that Japan has.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Zorgit. And that concludes this session. I'm very impressed with the far larger optimism in this country compared to 2 years ago. And thank you very much for coming to this panel. And I'd like to thank all the distinguished panel for your insights. And 会場の皆様どうぞ温かい拍手でパネリストの方々。
Well, thank you very much. Please thank them with a round of applause. All the panelists, thank you very much. Please thank them with a round of applause.